Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go. This is a lead article from today's newspaper, Hard Truths About India's Labour Reforms. The article initially discusses two things. In the context of one of the recently released report, it tries to establish the linkage between labour reforms and the benefit that has incurred in the economy. The article also discusses a fundamental problem of Indian economy of low employment rate. And even when employment is there, the quality of employment is very poor. The author then goes on to say that the labor reform has not helped the fundamental problem of the Indian economy. The assessment of the author is based on the report of V.V. Green National Labour Institute. This institute functions under the Ministry of Labour. V.V. Green National Labour Institute has come up with a report, Impact Assessment Study of the Labour Reforms Undertaken by the States. The study covers the span of 2004-5 to 2018-19, and it focuses on 6 states that have done substantial labour reform, beginning with Rajasthan, followed by other states like Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Jharkhand, and Uttar Pradesh. First of all, the report recognizes that labour laws are only one factor affecting business investment decision, because the investors do not go out hiring people just because it is easy to fire them. To hire people, first of all, the enterprise must have a growing market for its product or service. And many things must be put together for the enterprise to work, like capital, machinery, materials, lands, and not just labor. So if we focus just on labor reform and try to look as to what benefit it has caused in the economy, the result obviously will be very meager. The report unequivocally recognizes that the reforms of labor laws have had very little effect on increasing employment in large enterprises. It is the large enterprise that gives more skilled and more formal jobs. And large enterprises employ more number of people. But the impact of these reforms on the large enterprise has not been very substantial. On the contrary, Rajasthan, which was the first state to come up with substantial changes in the labor laws, and then the other states followed suit. But it so happens that Rajasthan has benefited the least from the reforms. The overall picture is also very grim. The report gives the data that the share of employment in plants, factories, employing more than 300 people has increased from 51.1% to 55.5% between the time span of 2010-11 to 2014-15. This was the time where mostly administrative reforms were being undertaken. This share of employment for large enterprises having more than 300 people increased marginally from 55.3% to 56.3% by the year 2017-18. But after 2014-15, it was the time of bolder reforms that were being taken by some states. And those reforms were favorable to the employers. The report says that the employment in formal enterprises is becoming more informal because the large investors, they can afford more capital, more automation, and they are also increasingly employing more number of people for short-term contracts. So the formal nature of job that are traditionally expected in large enterprises is diminishing. So there is some fundamental issue with the reforms that we have undertaken. Concerning labor reform, you must go back to the DNS of 22nd September 2020. Here it was discussed in great detail by the king of DNS, Baswa sir, and the other issue that has been highlighted in the article concerning low employment rate and low quality of employment that has been discussed in the DNS of 21st June 2022. So here we shall pick up the third issue which is relevant to the context, which is the issue fundamentally which is there concerning the kind of calculation of economic growth that we have, fundamentally which comes from GDP data. Once upon a time, Reserve Bank of India started measuring relation between the GDP growth and formal employment. It used to come up with a report called as Employment in Public and Organized Private Sectors. According to the data in these reports, between 1980 and 1990, every 1 percentage point of GDP growth generated roughly 2 lakh jobs in the formal sector. In the next decade, from 1990 to 2000, every 1 percent point of GDP growth now used to yield only 1 lakh formal jobs. This is half of the previous decade. The number will be further halved in the next decade. Between 2000 to 2010, every 1 percentage point growth in GDP yielded only around 52,000 new jobs in the formal sector. After 2011-12, RBI stopped giving the data. But if you want, you can extrapolate and have a rough idea as to what should be the situation now. We can very safely say that India's employment elasticity has been decreasing since 1980. This crucial thing of employment, and we are not being able to create high quality employment because, as it has been said, what we measure that affects us, that has a great influence in what we do. And what we have been measuring is largely GDP, the entire focus of economic data calculation that's based on GDP calculation. So there is fundamental issue with this. We have not been able to popularize other systems, other metrics of measurement. And the problem, the issues with GDP are too many. First of all, it does not give at all the accurate picture of the economy or the accurate picture of economic growth at the grassroots level. India is the sixth largest economy, but that does not necessarily mean that Indians are the sixth richest people on the planet. If one wants to get better understanding of the well-being of people in an economy, one should look at the GDP data. One should look at the GDP per capita data. The size of economy of India and UK are quite similar, but the GDP per capita are not. On an average, a UK's resident's income is 21 times more than an average Indian. It is also a fact that the impact of GDP growth on common people that progressively declines as the economy becomes larger and larger and the growth rate of GDP increases. The stage at which Sri Lanka is present, Sri Lanka produced around 2 lakhs job for every percentage growth of GDP in 1990s, but that also has dwindled to 90,000 by 2020. US today produces fewer jobs for every percentage point of GDP growth than what it did in 1990s. Similarly, China produces one-third the number of new jobs today than what it did in 1990s for every percentage point of GDP growth. So the GDP growth now does not necessarily mean more jobs and income for people, but that's what matters to common man. So still focusing on GDP numbers actually does not make sense anymore. That is why GDP numbers does not highlight the structural socio-politico-economic problems of the society. For instance, if we think about Sri Lanka's mass uprising, taking over of the president's house, the people's revolution that happened there can partly be explained due to the structural break, the decoupling between the headline GDP growth and economic prosperity of people. And when too much of media attention and focus is on GDP numbers, that obfuscates, that blurs, that underrates the discussion of real issues. And sometimes that is the cause of mass protest. World Bank and IMF, they for a long time in their reports have been projecting that the fastest growing economies are not able to provide prosperity and social mobility to their people. And this partly may be responsible for voters' sense of disillusionment, a sense of deception despite the economic gains in the country. And according to many reports, this is the reason why the electoral outcomes in favor of extreme positions in mature democracies like US, UK, and Germany are happening. So it's high time that we move away from just this GDP number and start measuring for real the socio-economic political realities at grassroots level. In 2008, back then, the then president of France formed a commission on measurement of economic performance and social progress. The commission had distinguished members like Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, The aim of the commission was to develop comprehensive measurement framework of economic and social performance as an alternative to GDP measurement. And the most important recommendation of this commission was to expand the dashboard to include more number of parameters, add multiple indicators, and that should be unique for a country. And since then, many indicators have been tried and tested. For instance, the concept of green GDP is getting popularized. Green GDP is an indicator of economic growth with environmental factors being taken into consideration along with the standard GDP of a country. So the green GDP factors biodiversity losses and the cost that are attributed to climate change. It's a general concept, and actually, green GDP can be measured in various ways. For example, it depends upon what factors exactly you are taking for measurement. You can take factors like carbon dioxide per year that has been generated, or the waste per capita that the country generates. So, the concept of green GDP is very similar to Sustainable Development Index. There's another index for measurement of economic welfare called as Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. OECD comes up with this index, and this accounts for both pollution cost and the distribution of income. So the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare adds up like this: personal consumption plus public non-defensive expenditures, meaning for the welfare of people. Then you subtract private defensive expenditures, add capital formation, add services from domestic labor, subtract the cost of environmental degradation, and further subtract the depreciation of natural capital. Natural capital is the sum total of the natural resources of the world or of that nation. Similar to this is genuine progress indicator. This indicator also adjusts for factors such as income distribution, and it adds factors like the value of household and volunteer work. It subtracts factors such as cost of crime and pollution. Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, it basically provides an insight to economic activities that diminishes both natural and social capital. So it separates out the concept of social progress from pure economic growth. Here in this graph, you can see the difference between GDP and the GPI for United States between 1950 to 2004. GDP per capita was rising and rising and rising and rising. But that's not the case for GPI per capita. The slope for this is very marginal, and in 1990s it started decreasing. And with time, the gap between the two is only increasing. So we can say that the genuine progress of United States is almost static. In reality, the progress from 1950s hasn't been so much. Then there are other indicators like Happy Planet Index, Gross National Happiness, the concept that was popularized by Bhutan, National Well-being Accounts. It's an accounting technique as an alternative to GDP measurement. Gross national happiness, this includes many other parameters like sustainable and equitable socio-economic development, environmental conservation, preservation and promotion of culture is also one of the parameters in Gross National Happiness Index. Good governance is also included here. Not exactly an alternative to GDP, but a measurement of growth and development can come from index like Gender Empowerment Measure. It is the United Nations Development Programme's attempt to measure the extent of gender inequality across the countries based on certain estimates like women's relative economic income, participation in high paying positions with economic power, and access to professional and parliamentary positions. There's another very important method of measuring the growth, and this perhaps is the most important contender to become an alternative to GDP. It is Inclusive Development Index. This index has been introduced by World Economic Forum. It takes four parameters into account. GDP per capita is there. But apart from that, you also have employment, productivity, and life expectancy. So the problem that we have discussed of jobless growth, decoupling of employment generation with GDP growth. If there is such a problem, that will be reflected in the measurement of Inclusive Development Index. Additionally, it's not just employment, it is also the quality of employment that will be taken account of via this factor of productivity. GDP, the concept, was conceived in 1930s by Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets. He rather warned that GDP measurement alone will never be the measurement of social well being. But because of simplicity, somehow the concept became very popular. But India now needs to overhaul its economic performance measurement framework. We must move away from excessive reliance on GDP growth numbers. We must move towards more comprehensive measurement framework of economic and social performance. So the dashboard must be enriched. We must include more parameters, more indicators, and club that with GDP per capita. There is an article on page number 6, why parties are going all out to woo Lingayats ahead of 2023 polls. From the perspective of prelims examination, we shall look at some basics of Lingayat.
First of all, the Lingayat sect is a Shaivite sect, and Shaivite sects have the theological basis of Advait, meaning monoism. But then there are various subsects within the sect of Shaivite, like for example Vishisht Advait or qualified monoism. Lingayat sect, which is a kind of Shaivite sect, follows the theology of qualified monoism, Vishisht Advait, meaning there is Advait, there is no dualism, there is monoism, but it is qualified monoism, meaning the Jiva and Brahma are the same, they get united once there is salvation, but still they do not become one. That distinction is still there even when Jiva gets united with Brahma. Jiva is similar to Brahma but not the same. If it is the same, that is monoism. In qualified monoism, Jiva is similar to Brahma, not the same. But more specifically, the theology of Lingayat sect is called as Shakti Vishisht Advait. The sect was founded by Lord Baswa, who was minister of King Bijala Kalachuri of Chalukyas of Kalyani. The theology of Lingayat was not new. It was based on Ramanuja's qualified monoism. But the Lingayat sect was noteworthy for the social doctrine that was propounded by Lord Baswa. Although found in many parts of the country, but they are predominantly found in the Mysore region and some parts of Andhra Pradesh. In Karnataka, they form 17% of the total population. The theology is very similar to Ramanuja's Vishisht Advait, but more specifically it is called as Shakti Vishisht Advait, where God is conceived to be qualified by Shakti or cosmic energy. Yoga and meditation are the paths to achieve the cosmic energy, and Lingayats do not do idol worship. As I have told you, the sect stood out because of the social doctrine. Lord Baswa tried to bring complete equality in the society. He challenged the Brahminical domination, raised voice against the caste system, untouchability, gender inequality, Vedic supremacy. He opposed all kind of ritualistic worship, all kind of sacrifice, even pilgrimage. Lord Baswa set up Anubhav Mandapa, where all men and women were welcomed from all socio-economic backgrounds to discuss spiritual questions of life. Lord Baswa popularized his social awareness message through poetries which were called as Vachanas. These Vachanas are considered to bring Renasa in the Kannada literature. Lord Baswa also coined the slogan of Kayakav Kailasa, which means work is worship. The message is similar to the message given by Swami Vivekananda. The goal is to set a standard in society where all work are valued. No work is considered menial. Respect is given to all, not depending upon the kind of work people are doing in society. That is very, very important to fight untouchability, to fight the caste system hierarchy which has been made artificially in the society. He promoted widows' remarriage. Concerning theology, you have to know that Lingayats oppose image worship. In this sect, only sacred image is the Linga of Lord Shiva. Lingayats do not eat meat, they don't smoke, they don't drink. Lingayats also oppose cremation and they follow the burial rituals. The sacred literature of Lingayats are in Karnese and Telugu. This much about Lingayat will suffice for the examination.
There is an article on page number 1. Supreme Court orders a status quo on move to put panel in charge of Indian Olympic Association. Basically, Supreme Court has restrained the order of the Delhi High Court, directing the center to form Committee of Administrators for Indian Olympic Association. See, this is a developing news, and ultimately what order Supreme Court will pass, we do not know yet. When the orders will be passed, news will come and it will be discussed then. Right now, you have to make one observation that Supreme Court is exercising restraint. In another news, you must also have read today that Supreme Court has denied to give orders to center for giving compensation to falsely accused people. There are people languishing in jail and then they are acquitted after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, sometimes even more. So much of time of their life is lost and there is no compensation for that. But Supreme Court, using its wisdom, has not given any direction to the center because it understands that it does not have the financial power to enforce such a direction. The compensation will amount to a huge sum of money. So in that case as well, the Supreme Court has exercised restraint.
Judicial activism has been covered in the DNS previously, and judicial activism is something that you hear more often than judicial restraint. But many a times we see instances of judicial restraint as well. Judicial restraint is a theory in the legal jurisprudence that encourages judges to limit the exercise of their own power. It encourages judges to have a rethink, maybe to hesitate to strike down the laws, unless they are obviously against the Constitution. Lawmaking is the job of the legislature, and deciding on their constitutional validity is the job of judiciary. Under the practice of judicial restraint, judiciary looks into the legislative intent rather than the nitty-gritty and the exact provision of the legislation. As the phrase itself suggests, in judicial restraint, more restraint is exercised by the judges, less of innovation, less of wide open interpretation. The original intent of the writers of the Constitution is looked into. In judicial activism, more liberal interpretation of the Constitution is done. The interpretation that is not found in the intention of the Constitution makers. The judges take the interpretation so liberally that it goes far away from the original intent of the Constitution framers. Like Supreme Court of India has done to many articles, especially Article 21. In judicial restraint, judges look for precedent rather than liberal interpretation and innovation. Judicial restraint is very important in preserving the balance of power, but it works best when all the branches of the government, judiciary, executive and legislature are working perfectly fine. If the executive and legislature are abdicating their responsibility, then a vacuum is created for judiciary to fill, and that gives rise to judicial activism. For example, if legislature and executive are not giving enough attention to rights of the citizens, to environment, then in that case, judiciary start to take up the job. For example, MC Mehta case regarding BS4 vehicles. Supreme Court framed Vishakha guidelines. Those were the job of executive and legislature. If executive and legislature are proactive, there is no need of judicial activism. Judicial restraint is best to be followed then. Because judges neither have the expertise nor the resource to solve major problem in the society, and additionally, if judges start to impinge into the domain of executive and legislature, it is bound to have a strong reaction from politicians as well. And then problems will start arising concerning the appointment of judges, corrupt practices, and more. All in all, balance of power will be disturbed if one organ starts to impinge into the domain of other. On the other hand, if executive and legislature are not doing up their job, it is in the best interest of the citizens for judiciary to be proactive. You must have a long list of examples of judicial activism. But for exam, you must also have some examples on your tips regarding judicial restraint. Huge controversy was created regarding Aadhaar bill being passed as money bill. But Supreme Court did not indulge into the constitutionality of passing Aadhaar bill as money bill because Supreme Court looked at the intent of the legislation. As we have seen here, legislative intent is to be looked upon in practice of judicial restraint and not into the nitty-gritty and the specific provision of the law. Supreme Court also showed restraint on the issue of Article 370, did not pass any judgment regarding center abrogating this article. Supreme Court also showed extraordinary restraint in cancellation of Rafale deal. And recently, Supreme Court has refrained from giving any orders to stall the Central Vista project.
There is an article on the text and context page the recent blocking of the VLC Media Player. You must surely be aware of this fact that all of a sudden, VLC Media Player website was blocked in India. And even after RTI filing, the reason has not been known yet. But this has been understood since VLC Media Player has Chinese connection. So that could be one reason, because of national security, that this step must have been taken by Government of India. Here, in general, we shall have a discussion oriented towards the demand of the exam, towards the general Chinese app that poses national security risk to India. Do Chinese firms poses a security threat? The intelligence assessment of India and also worldwide has cautioned that direct and indirect link with many Chinese companies, that there are direct and indirect links of People's Liberation Army of China with many Chinese companies. In fact, in 2017, China passed a national intelligence law which gave China power over Chinese companies working overseas. And the security threat to other nations stemmed from this particular legislation, because this legislation required Chinese company to fully support, provide full assistance and cooperation to China's national intelligence work wherever those companies are operating. Article 7 of this law states, any organization or citizen shall support, assist and cooperate with the state intelligence work in accordance with the law. And that is why FDI coming from China is now seen with lots of caution. In India too, we have presence of Chinese giant. For example, ex-India Steels Limited. This is by far the largest joint venture between India and China. The main investor in this venture is Chinese Xinjiang Cathay International Group, and they have commissioned palletization facility of worth 250 crore. Xinjiang Cathay International Group actually has been reorganized, reconstructed from institutions of General Logistic Department of PLA. So allegedly it is directly linked with PLA. Same goes with Huawei. The founder of Huawei has been associated with PLA since 1987. Although now he is not, but in 1977 he was PLA's engineering corps. And this is one of the major pretexts why Huawei is seen as national security threat and has been banned in many countries including US and UK. Then other companies like CETC, which manufacture military electronics and CCTV cameras, they also have presence in India. In 2018, CETC announced $46 million investment in 200 megawatt photovoltaic manufacturing unit in Andhra Pradesh. But this company has been implicated by US Department of Justice at least 3 times for illegal export, and in fact many employees have been convicted for military espionage. So huge presence of these companies obviously poses security threat to India. Chinese has been investing in India's startup to a great extent. For example, in Zomato by Alibaba, in Swiggy, in Ola, Paytm, Flipkart, BigBasket, Dream11, Oya, Udaan, Byju's. And this is one way of integrating Indian economy with the Chinese economy.